Joe, it's so great to connect today. We have a mutual friend in Paul Gustafson, and of course, lots of overlapping career interests. So it's great to be able to chat with you today.
Oh, thanks, Nate, for the invitation. And Paul's a wonderful friend and amazing guy.
Done incredible work, and he is one of the people that is responsible for me pursuing my PhD in organizational behavior. And Joe, as you think back on the things you've learned over your incredible career, what lessons would you most like to pass on to future generations?
Yeah, all the hard knocks I've encountered. So one of the things that I've done a lot of is 360-degree feedback. And if people don't know what that is, it's a really good way to torture people because basically we have a survey that you give to your manager, your peers, your direct reports, and other people. And it's anonymous. And then we say to people, we won't tell the respondent who you are. So just tell them what you really think. Okay. And give them feedback. And actually what's interesting about it is one of the funny things in life is if you ask people to sort of predict what they're good at and what they're not good at, and you ask any other rater that knows them well, you know who the worst person is at knowing what they're good at and bad at?
You would think it would be the person who doesn't live with that person in their head, but right, it's the one. It's ourselves, right?
Yeah. We're the worst. We either overrate or underrate. But as we've studied it and we've looked at, R squared, and we've looked at your ability to predict your strengths and weaknesses versus any boss, peer, direct report, or other people are twice as accurate as you are.
Wow.
You don't get it. You don't see it, right? And so that's one of the mysteries, if you will, of life. So we discovered this a long time ago. I was actually started to work with Bill Dyer, and he's one of the kind of the masters of the field, and Gene Dalton and Paul Thompson and these guys, and they were doing 360-degree feedback early on. They created one of the first 360s, and it's grown a lot since then, and it's changed a lot. And we actually find that if you look at the ability to predict potential, right, in a leader, when we've measured it, we looked at like Hogan psychological assessments versus 360. And the best correlation to potential we could come up with is about 0.13. But with 360, the correlation was 0.55.
Wow.
I mean, it is so much better because other people kind of see you and they're accurate, and we think it's a great way to predict potential. So you can imagine getting this feedback report with all this information from other people. And when people look at it, they're going down through it, and rank order stuff. This is the stuff you're really good at, and this stuff you're really bad at. And what's interesting about people's natural approach to what they do with that is they look at the good stuff and go, oh, okay, I'm pretty good. And then they look at the bad stuff and they go, oh, crap. And then when they say, well, what are you going to work on to improve? Guess what it is?
The good stuff?
Nope. It's the bad stuff. I mean, our natural inclination is to kind of sort of accept what we're good at, but then to work on the weaknesses, right? And that was my mentality for 25 years. I would give people this feedback and I'd say, figure out why you're such a loser. It's like they pick the most negative thing and they go, oh, I'm not very good at this. And then you say, well, get better. And after a while, I ended up being in the same offices as my partner, Jack Zenger. And Jack's a curious person. He's the most curious person I've ever met in my life. But he and I got together and we wrote this book called The Extraordinary Leader. And in that, he started asking me questions. And one of the questions he said was, what's the impact of doing things well? Okay. And I thought, well, let's look at it. I don't know. But we made an interesting discovery there. What we discovered was that 80% of the time, people would be better off focusing on developing a strength than working on a weakness.
Mm.
Our natural inclination is to work on the stuff we're not good at, right? But when we looked at the power of doing something well, the problem, what we found was if you didn't have any strength, and a strength we defined as one of the competencies we measured at the 90th percentile. So something you're really good at, right? So if you didn't have any strengths, your average effectiveness was the 34th percentile. So you're in the bottom third with no strengths. But if you did one thing well, and we measured people on 19 dimensions, if you did 1 out of 19 really well, you'd say, well, yeah, the average is going to go up because you do one thing well. And if you say, well, how much? A good mathematician say, well, 1/19th, right? Because they're all equal, right? Well, it turns out if you do one thing well, you move from the 34th percentile to the 64th percentile, the bottom third to almost the top third, right? And if you did 3 things well, you're in the 81st percentile. You're in the top 20% of leaders. And it started to get us thinking about what effective leadership was. Because, can anybody do 19 things really well? But could you do 3? Could you be really, really good at 3 things, And Nate, as you think about your career, and it's like, what's helped you the most? Has it been, sort of correcting your weaknesses, or was it standing out in some way and really demonstrating competence in a few things? And so we flip-flopped that, and we started to say, what makes a great leader is that they're really good at a few things. And if you think of a leader like Steve Jobs, right? Did Steve Jobs have any profound strengths? Absolutely. Communication, vision, drive.
Yeah.
Was he perfect?
Far from.
No. He had a mess of really weaknesses, and sometimes we call them fatal flaws. So, but why was he so great? Well, he was really good at a few things. He really hit home runs on a few things, and he wasn't great at everything. But that's what most of us are like, right? And so that's as we started to think about helping leaders to develop, what we've started to do is say to that 80%, hey, take something you're okay at it and make it great. So that was a big insight for me, and that changed the way I thought about developing. And I think as I've talked to leaders, it's interesting to share that philosophy with them and have them go, oh man, I've never thought about that. Because I always, through life, whenever I went to a class or did anything, I'd always sort of work on, what's wrong and what could I do better, and and I didn't sort of say, how could I stand out? It's just a funny thing. And I think, the lessons you learn in school sort of point you towards what's wrong.
Well, Joe, I teach leadership, and I just had that kind of light bulb moment as you were describing this, that realization of course we can't be good at everything. And my mind goes to sports. So I think of, let's imagine we give Tom Brady a 360-degree feedback, and it's, rating him on sure, throwing ability, but also tackling ability and blocking ability and running ability. He's going to fail almost all of them.
Yeah. Especially if you give it to Giselle, you know?
Yeah, right. I mean, right. There's so nobody can optimize on every single variable.
No.
And this insight, I think, is just fantastic of the importance of acknowledging that
Hmm.
and then really just leaning into our strengths. And like you said, even Steve Jobs, he had what would be called fatal flaws.
Yes.
These weren't minor
No. No.
shortcomings.
No. Yeah, he's our classic example of it. People say, "Well, can you have both strengths and fatal flaws?" It's, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It ends up pulling you down. You should be at the 81st or 95th percentile, but you're down at the 80th. And you know what? And if you ask people what happens with people with fatal flaws, if they have profound strength, is other people cover for them,
Yeah.
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And you think about what's happening with Joe Biden right now, and it's like, yeah, there's a lot of people covering for him, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's got, some weaknesses. I don't know if it's fatal flaws, but it's people are taking care of stuff for him, which is good. That's great. We need people, and we all need people to do that,
Yeah.
and so that's, I think, a fundamental thing that we've discovered that I think can help most people is what are you good at?
Well, there was a class I took in undergrad where they introduced me to the idea of paradigm shift. And I forget the examples they used, but I remember this moment of like, oh yeah, when you see the world from a totally different lens. And I'm really grateful that we got to talk today because you have done that for me with this simple lesson that you've passed on and observed and learned that, you know, it's so important for leaders to lean into their strengths. And like you said, let other people cover for our weaknesses.
Yeah, and really when you talk about it, I mean, if it's just this, I'm a little bit better at this. So what we found is that there was this real power with sort of 90th percentile, with being really good at something, really standing out, and which another insight that we had was we had this big insight. We said, hey, let's tell leaders to build strengths. And then we had this kind of dilemma of saying, well, how do you build a strength?
Yeah.
Because we knew how to work and fix weaknesses, but let me give you an example. So let's say that you're really bad at honesty and integrity. So what would you do to get better? Well, you could stop lying,
Right.
quit cheating, right? I mean, it's like, okay, quit being the deceitful bum. Yeah, okay. So if you have a weakness, how do you get better? Well, you quit doing bad things and start doing good. So we call that linear development. But let's say you're really pretty good at honesty. People say, yeah, pretty honest guy, but not great. But you want to be great at it. And how would you go from good to great? And if you ask people, they'd say, well, just be more honest. You just be honest all the time. Just be honest harder. And all those things, just have people, they're not, there's nothing to do there. And we sort of say this linear approach, if you're bad at technical skills, how do you get better? Take a class, read a book.
Yeah.
Well, wonder if you've taken all the classes and read all the books, how do you become great at it? Well, so what we found is this funny thing about competencies. And when we looked at the data, and this is, if you think about the power of AI, the power of AI comes because if you have enough data, you can figure anything out.
Yeah.
And so here's what we did. We had thousands of managers. We had data on them, and we looked at people that were the most honest. And then we started to say, were there other behaviors that helped them to demonstrate their honesty, right? And so what we found is a series of behaviors. For instance, one of the what we called strength builders was assertiveness.
Okay.
And you kind of go, well, you don't have to be assertive to be honest, do you? And you can probably think of somebody who's pretty honest, but they're not very assertive.
Mm-hmm.
But when we looked at the data, what we found is those people that were rated the highest on honesty tended to be more assertive. And when you say why, it's like, well, imagine sitting in a meeting and something that said this goes against your stated values. And you sit there and you kind of go, should I say something or should I sit here? I mean, so what competency is it that helps you to stand up and say, I disagree, we can't do that? That's assertiveness.
Yeah.
And so what we found is that these strength builders help you to really become great at a competency. And so, one competency helps you to be better at another competency. That was an interesting insight, but it helped us create a guide to help people build strengths. How do you do it? Use these strength builders.
Yeah, interesting. So how do people find these strength builders?
They need a very large database or they need to get it from us. We're the only organization that has this technology, that uses it. Everybody else goes around with this idea of linear development. Just be better, just do it more. And so if you look, there's a HBR article that we wrote several years ago that has some examples of that. But if you go to zingerfolkman.com and look at, we have articles on every competency, and we'll talk about these strength builders in those competencies and sort of what you can do. And there's lots of webinars there you can watch too, to kind of understand how to build a strength, how to become great at something. So that's the only way I know how to do it is look at our research.
Well, that's great, Joe. I'll link to that in the show notes here of the podcast. Any final lessons you'd like to pass on as we wrap up?
What's interesting about this whole field of development is when we look at our database of leaders that have gone through a 360-degree feedback process, the average age of those leaders is 43. So people go to work in their 20s.
Yeah.
And so we wait 20 years to sort of give them feedback. Does that seem ridiculous to you? I mean, we wait 20 years before they can get, they know how other people see them.
Yeah.
And we keep saying we start too late. We wait too long to help people understand how they're doing as a leader and give them insight into, developing as a leader. And thank you for teaching that in one of your classes. But again, the hard thing to learn is, how am I perceived? How do people perceive me? And so we just encourage people to really dive into leadership development earlier and try to get feedback earlier. And, one of the, I think, critical skills that really help people is just this idea of coachability, this idea of asking for feedback. How am I doing? What could I have done better? And being coachable throughout your career. And if people, we find, if we measure coachability, at 25, 26, 30, people are pretty coachable. But if you look at the curve on that, every day, every year that people age, it goes down, and so people become less coachable as they get older, unless they develop that habit of asking for feedback and just trying to incorporate it into their, and so that's what I'd encourage people to do, is to continue to ask others for feedback. Again, you're the worst person at knowing whether you're great or horrible. Other people can see it quite clearly, but they'll tell you if you ask them. They won't I mean, you've got to really ask them nicely. You've got to find a truth teller to really tell you.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important skill to learn.
Well, Joe, this was excellent. Like I said, it was a paradigm shift for me. And secondly, my leadership course is wrapping up this semester, and we're discussing leadership development next week. So this is timely
Great.
for me. I look forward to incorporating this in all of my classes moving forward. So I just want to thank you for sharing these lessons you've learned over such an incredible career. Just really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast today.
Thanks, Nate. It's been a delight. Appreciate you.